literally just hours away from week 2 fantasy football starting back up, and I've been waiting for this moment since the moment that the Monday night game ended against the New York Jets versus the Buffalo Bills in week 1. So today we need to go over the most ignored position by far in all of fantasy football, which of course is the kicker position. And we're getting into the top 12 kickers for week 2 fantasy football. And I am the only fantasy football YouTuber who covers kickers in fantasy football. So please make sure to drop a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to show support for the channel. And we're going to kick it off here with our first tier. And at number 1 here, we've got Nick Folk of the Tennessee Titans taking on the Los Angeles Chargers in week 1. So Nick Folk in week 1, 18 fantasy points. Like, you cannot tell me that the kicker position does not matter in traditional redraft leagues or even in dynasty leagues where you have a kicker slot open. Nick Folk was perfect for field goals made. 5 for 5, 50 was his longest. Didn't attempt any extra points, and that's exactly what you want from a fantasy football kicker. While that sounds kind of counterintuitive there a little bit, because the reality is with fantasy football kickers, you don't want kickers on top offenses always. You want kickers on offenses that are good enough to get them down there in shape and in position to kick a field goal where they can get a 40-yarder, a 50-yarder, a 60-yarder if they have the leg for it. Nick Folk this week taking on the Chargers, they're going to need to play catch-up in this game, and I do think that this defense is not good enough to stop them, and stop them at least from getting down towards the red zone, where Nick Folk is going to have several more opportunities to capitalize on in week 2. Jason Sanders at number 2, taking on the New England Patriots in New England this week. So obviously, Jason Sanders was a part of that massive matchup in Los Angeles this past week versus the Chargers. 14 fantasy points. He was perfect for field goals. Missed an extra point here that actually could have cost them at the end of that game. Ended up not costing them, obviously, since Miami won. But Jason Sanders, this is kind of an exception offense and also just really an exception matchup here because Miami, while they are one of the most explosive offenses in the NFL, the New England defense is definitely tougher than the Chargers defense this week. So the New England defense is going to hold them probably to more field goals than the Chargers were able to do. So I think that this matchup actually is going to suit Jason Sanders well. He just needs to clean up on that extra point misses. We cannot have that type of behavior in future weeks. We've got Tyler Bass at number 3 of the Buffalo Bills taking on the Las Vegas Raiders at home in Buffalo. So obviously Tyler Bass is coming off that performance where he barely sent the Buffalo Bills to overtime against the Jets in that game off that doink 50-yard field goal that he ended up making. It was pretty lucky, but still, Tyler Bass has been consistently a good kicker since he's been in the NFL. He is perfect on field goals, perfect on extra points in this game, 13 fantasy points in this game as well. So Tyler Bass, in this offense, honestly, I do think that there's an element of maybe the Buffalo Bills offense is just not as good as we once thought they were. I mean, obviously they looked bad on Monday night in week 1 versus the Jets, but I think that one of the reasons that Tyler Bass is a very good consistent kicker option in fantasy is because Buffalo is kind of one of those teams that doesn't always score a lot of touchdowns. They're not a Miami Dolphins. They're not a Kansas City Chiefs. They're not even a Cincinnati Bengals level offense. So I think that this week against the Raiders here, they're obviously going to be in a bad mood as a team, and they're going to be looking to go out there and kick some butt this week. Tyler Bass is going to be just fine in fantasy football. He's a very consistent start option for you if you've got him in fantasy football. I wouldn't worry about dropping him really ever. Jake Elliott is at number 4 here of the Philadelphia Eagles, taking on the Minnesota Vikings tonight in Philadelphia right here. Jake Elliott, 18 points in fantasy football this past week with a mixed extra point on top of that. That's because he kicked 4 field goals and made all 4 of them and made a 56-yard long field goal in week 1. Obviously, they took on a much tougher defense than what they're taking on in week 2. I mean, the New England Patriots defense is so much tougher than the Minnesota defense is. Minnesota is going to allow Philadelphia to score more touchdowns this week. That's why Jake Elliott's a little bit lower on this list, but I still do think he'll kick a couple field goals, make maybe a 30-40 yarder at some point. I think that Jake Elliott is going to be pretty consistent as well. Dropping down to number 5, we've got Cameron Dicker here of the Los Angeles Chargers, taking on the Tennessee Titans in Tennessee this week. Cameron Dicker is honestly one of the most accurate kickers in the league. He's basically always perfect. This guy really does not miss many kicks in this league. And obviously last week he had the advantage of being in that high-flying matchup. He got 12 points in fantasy this past week. It's not the same matchup. Obviously it's a different matchup, and it's not going to be that high of a scoring upside from an offensive standpoint. But again, I think that what this does is it actually puts Cameron Dicker in a better situation to score more field goals this week. He only kicked 2 field goals last week. I think that Tennessee's defense is tougher than the Miami Dolphins. Although they're not good against the pass, they're very good against the run. And Austin Ekeler is struggling this week with an injury himself. So I think that Cameron Dicker actually could be a line for about 4 field goals in this game. And if he gets in range, he's going to make it. He's just very accurate as a kicker. Number 6, I've got Dustin Hopkins of the Cleveland Browns taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers in Pittsburgh on Monday night. Dustin Hopkins is also a very consistent guy as well. 12 points in fantasy football in week 1, made every single kick that he took. He took 4 kicks as well. I think this is going to be a more competitive matchup in week 2 than it was in week 1. So I think that Cleveland, they're basically got the same ceiling offense every week. They're really around a 24 to 30 point team on a good day. And I think that a lot of those situations, Deshaun Watson will get this team into range, and then they will let Dustin Hopkins kick a 40-yarder. So I think that Dustin Hopkins, he's going to be just fine this week as well. Number 7, I've got Blake Group of the New Orleans Saints taking on the Carolina Panthers in Carolina this week. Blake Group, I'll be honest, I had never heard of this guy before watching the games in week 1. I had no idea who this guy was, but the dude was really good. 12 fantasy points. He was perfect on every single kick he made a 52-yard long field goal. This offense is obviously much more improved than it was last year. So the kicker is going to have higher upside in fantasy football than he did last year, dealing with guys like Jameis Winston and Andy Dalton at quarterback. Derek Carr solidified this team, and you saw it in week 1. You're going to see it again here against the Carolina Panthers, who I expect the New Orleans Saints to roll over, and I expect Blake Group to have several more opportunities in this particular game. Probably ends up with like 5 or 6 kicks this week, actually, so he might actually have a better week this week. Younghoe Koo is at number 8 of the Atlanta Falcons, taking on the Green Bay Packers at home in Atlanta. So I think that the best thing about Younghoe Koo is his name. I mean, that's a great name, right? But the reality is he is a good kicker as well. The problem that he had last year is he wasn't as consistent season long. He looks like he's cleaned up a little bit of those issues this week. At least in week 1 he did. He was perfect on every single kick. Only had 1 field goal attempt. That's because they were cramming the ball down Carolina's throats all the way to the end zone. I don't think it's going to happen this week against Green Bay. Green Bay's got a tougher defense, and I think that Atlanta is going to be in a much more competitive matchup that will require Younghoe Koo to get a 30 or 40-yard field goal. So I like Younghoe Koo this week absolutely just fine. Number 9, Brandon Aubrey of the Dallas Cowboys taking on the New York Jets in Dallas this week. One of the best matchups of the week for sure. It's going to be a low-scoring game in my opinion, which will probably call for a lot of field goals. And that's exactly what the types of games that we really like to see for fantasy football kickers specifically. Obviously, they crushed the Giants last week, and he ended up with 10 fantasy points, which was obviously very good. But I think that this week he has potential to attempt like 4 or 5 field goals, and he could definitely hit like 15 points in this particular week. Harrison Butker at number 10 of the Kansas City Chiefs taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars in Jacksonville this week. So Harrison Butker is honestly like one of the biggest facades in fantasy football as far as kickers go, in my opinion. Because what we discussed earlier, fantasy football kickers on really high efficiency offenses that get the ball into the end zone. That's the best way to put it. Offenses that get the ball into the end zone and not just stall out in the red zone, those are the offenses that honestly kickers are not as great on. And you saw it last week at Arrowhead against the Detroit Lions. Like, he had 8 fantasy points, which isn't a bad week, but they were mostly efficient when they got down towards the red zone. So he only had 2 field goal opportunities. The reason that I like him better this week is because he's taken on the Jacksonville Jaguars, in my opinion, and I've said it in lots of videos this week, will be the matchup of the week in fantasy football. There's going to be points everywhere in this game. So I think that Harrison Butker, he's probably going to have a couple more opportunities to get a field goal. He's going to have more extra points to kick. Harrison Butker is going to be fine this week. Number 11, Brandon McManus of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Same exact matchup, same exact situation. The guy literally exactly alike last week. 8 fantasy points, 1 field goal attempt, 4 extra points made in this particular week versus the Indianapolis Colts in week 1. This week is so much different. Like I said, points are going to be flying. I want in on this matchup literally at every level of the field. So I'm going to go ahead and say Brandon McManus is going to be a good option in week 2. Rounding out the top 12, we've got Evan McPherson having a bounce back game along with all the Cincinnati Bengals this week, taking on the Baltimore Ravens at home in Cincinnati. Obviously, the Bengals got embarrassed in week 1. This is a very good team that's not going to take that lightly, and they're going to be way more competitive. And I think that the good thing, again, the good thing about this type of matchup here is that it's a divisional matchup. It's a tough opponent against Baltimore. So Cincinnati may not have their most efficient week on offense this week. But I tell you this, they're going to get Evan McPherson in more situations where he can have opportunities to kick a field goal. That's why I like Evan McPherson in week 2. So let me know what you think of the rankings in the comments below and what matchup questions you need answered before week 2 fantasy football starts. And if you want to see the top 12 fantasy defenses for week 2 fantasy football, click on this video right here.